Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, More Value, Less Effort, where we'll be discussing tips for working smarter, not harder on your sustainability program development. My name is Kelia Callan and I'm part of the marketing team here at Measurabl. First up, we have Becca Becca, the VP of Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility at Jamestown, who leads initiatives of the Jamestown Green Program and Jamestown Charitable Foundation. As a powerhouse sustainability team of one, Becca has demonstrated that you don't need a huge in-house team to make a big difference at your organization. Second, we have Chris Way, Senior Energy Engineer at Verdani Partners, who leads the technical services team where he helps owners and operators run more sustainable portfolios. Over the years, he's worked closely with Becca and other sustainability managers on energy conservation projects in order to help those sites run more efficiently. Last and certainly not least, Melissa Bartow joins me from the Measurabl team. Melissa is the Director of Partner Development. In this role, she identifies partners who provide significant value for our clients. In her prior role at Measurabl, she worked with Becca and Chris closely to advance Jamestown's sustainability and reporting initiatives. So thank you to all three panelists for joining us today. What we've done here is outlined 4 steps in which you can help advance any sustainability program by using data to drive those processes. So let's get started. First step, automate your data collection. This is a challenge that a lot of owners and operators experience as they're collecting data from their buildings. They don't always have access to what they need. And Mel, you've worked extensively in getting all the data from not only one building, but a portfolio of buildings into one place. Can you tell us your best tips for ESG data collection?
Thank you, Kalia, and good morning, everyone on the line. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning. So great question. When you're looking at a portfolio, I think the main issue a lot of people get, what stumps them is how to get started, because they might have anywhere between a 50 building portfolio to a 2,000 building portfolio. And what I listen to my customers is they really want a solution that they can oversee, they can drill down to a site level and a portfolio level. So, and to alleviate the manual burden that they put onto their teams that have once been manually entering this data. So I think that looking at solutions in the market where you can automate processes and relieve burden for manual and key entry from your team will be a win-win across the board.
Awesome, thank you for that. And Becca, we've talked about this before. You've built the sustainability program at Jamestown from essentially the ground up. What advice do you have for someone who's been in your shoes? What common mistakes can they avoid, and what are best practices that you would suggest for getting all of your data from your portfolio?
That's a great question, and hey everyone on the line today. I think starting out, the most important thing that I did when I stepped in was helping really to do kind of a big cleanup, just to make sure that all of the space metrics, occupancy figures were correct, and that importantly that all of the accounts were represented. That required a lot of education. So, making sure that not only was I asking the question to the property managers and the building teams, but also that I was giving them the information so that they could give me the correct answer. For example, the fact that I needed whole building data was something that was easily and often kind of confused by site level users that might have thought that I only needed bills that the landlord was paying. So making sure that you're getting whole building data and kind of clearly communicating your data standards was really important early on.
Definitely. And can you talk to us more about the process that you went through to go from essentially just having maybe your utility bills to getting that more granular data that you needed to really operate your portfolio efficiently?
Yeah, well, on the utility side, we did automate as much as we could. Obviously, energy and water was a little bit easier to automate than waste, but we did see a lot of diversity by geography. And I think what you're getting to is some of the kind of more detailed building level energy management tools that we use. So we use programs that provide 15-minute interval data at a number of our properties. What was nice about that was we were able to get performance feedback in real time or maybe within 24 hours, as opposed to just reacting to what we get on a bill on each billing cycle. They both kind of serve different purposes. So the monthly data is really helpful for ongoing kind of annual reporting, as well as, you know, just trends over a longer period of time. Whereas for the building operators, in order to actually intervene and make an operational change, that interval data was really helpful.
Awesome. And for someone who's getting started, say that they're only getting utility bill data today, what advice would you give to someone? What other issues might they need to consider that maybe they've overlooked, and how should they get started?
You know, I think once your kind of data is up to date and complete, I think you can do some analysis as to kind of where your charges are coming from. For example, I know that a lot of platforms now track peak demand charges, and peak demand is an area where whether you're using a more advanced software that's looking at meter equipment level information in more detail, or if you're just getting the peak demand charges off your bills, I think it's easy to isolate kind of when you're using energy as a driver of increased cost, and you know, would allow an operator to kind of focus their efforts during those periods of peak demand.
Got it. And Chris, maybe you can answer this question as well, but what was the process like going from mostly focusing on and collecting energy data to gathering other types of utility data as well? How did you make that transition?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think the key thing is really just to be as organized as possible. I think that was really the key transition in going from, you know, collecting utility, actual bills to actually implementing whole building data request process through, you know, your local utility provider. So, you know, just going through that request process. And I think you just have to be really good at tracking things like your meter number, your account information, and just really making sure that everything in the building is being accounted for. You know, I do see some common mistakes with a lot of property teams maybe. You know, when I go approach them and ask them if they have all their meter information, but everything's kind of all over the place. Maybe they're only tracking their information that the landlord is paying, but not necessarily specific tenant information. Like, for example, if you have maybe a retail or a restaurant, sometimes these tenants pay their bills directly. So sometimes getting that information can be a challenge, but it is something that you definitely have to capture in order to get whole building data, because these local ordinances will require whole building information. So I think just staying organized was the key thing.
Becca, anything to add on that transition?
You know, Chris, I think one issue that just came to mind was, you know, some municipalities or utilities have reports available for different purposes. So I think, you know, being clear about what you're using the data for. For example, are you just trying to comply with a local law that might have, you know, annual deadline, you know, at one point in the year? Or are you trying to get that data on an ongoing, you know, monthly basis so that you can, you know, track trends throughout the year? I think just kind of knowing how you're going to use the information is helpful. And certainly communicating that so that whoever's providing the information to you doesn't make assumptions that aren't correct.
Got it. And Mel, I mentioned this earlier, but you've obviously spent a lot of time collecting all this data. So anything to add on how companies over time will transition from just getting energy data to collecting, you know, water, waste?
Yeah, and another really good question, and Chris, feel free to chime in here. What I see a lot is clients will come in and they'll have everything segmented in Excel spreadsheets, and they'll go, hey, Measurabl, we've been tracking this in Energy Star, we've been tracking this in a Word document in Excel. We know where to look for all these, so I wouldn't say it's like Chris's, to your point, it's if you stay organized, maybe you're completely fine. And if you only have 10 buildings in your portfolio. But what I see is this transition from perhaps legacy solutions to trying to bring this into softwares. And as I attend a lot of conferences, I just hear this integration pattern happening. It's no longer okay to have just your accounting software, your sustainability software, your leasing platform. Customers are really craving for an integration and an open connected platform. So no longer sustainability is siloed in like a business unit alone, that it really has a business case and business implication for the rest of their organization. I don't know if that answers your question, but kind of bringing the, out of Excel, so, you're only emailing data between each other to a platform that everyone can log into. I think there's a lot of solutions that are doing that well. Measurabl is one of them, but there's a lot of solutions like Becca mentioned. There's 15-minute interval data companies, getting that granular data so your property teams can be making real-time decisions is also beneficial to, lead online. So there's a multitude of systems out there that are doing it well. I think the next phase will be automating data collection. Yes, that's one, but then streamlining and integrating this data collection. I don't know, Becca, Chris, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think any owner has experienced at least this benchmarking energy or water or waste experience. What's the square footage? What's the gross square footage of your building? And you ask 5 different people, you might get 5 different answers. And so I think, integration can really help, ensure that there's kind of a consistent source of information, whether it's being used, like you said, by accounting or sustainability or another kind of operational department. So yeah, I think the platform integration is definitely a trend and something that's happening. I don't think it's really kind of played out yet. So I think people are still trying to figure out how that works. But I think there's a lot of kind of intermediate solutions. Like for example, right currently in our portfolio, we push our data from Energy Star into Measurabl. And that's just kind of one way that we've made it so that we input the information once, but then we get to take advantage of it in these multiple platforms. And then from Energy Star, our data also gets used for lead projects in the ARC platform. So that's just one example of how we've started to kind of tie into some of our other software partners.
Right, and I'm going to use that as a segue to the next step, which is step 2, basically asking, once you get all of this data into one platform or maybe multiple platforms, as we just spoke to with the integrations, what do you actually do with that data? How are you making the most of it, and how is it truly providing value to your organization? So Chris, I'm going to bat this one over to you. As someone who analyzes a lot of data, what's the easiest way to identify that low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think with the data, it really allows you to really dive deep and analyze where certain improvements can be made. So, what I typically like to do is analyze, monthly data. And, by analyzing that monthly data, I'm able to see kind of, month over month, how much it was able to drop, really like analyzing any discrepancies or any spikes that you can see. And with that, you're able to not only, adjust the data to make sure that it's as accurate as possible, but you can also look into, any areas where you're, using too much water or using too much energy. So I think I can probably explain a few examples where that came into play. I remember one particular property where I think it was their gas usage. And we did notice a huge drop in a few months where their gas usage basically went from, like 500-600 therms to basically 0. And once we saw that, we were able to reach out to the property team, and we determined that the gas meter was actually broken. So for several months, they actually showed 0 consumption on their bill. So it was something that really helped the team look into and get their gas meter fixed. But without that data, we probably wouldn't have known, and the property team wouldn't have been aware of that as well. So I think that's one excellent example where I was able to use tools like Energy Star Portfolio Manager or Measurabl to analyze the data to see, to kind of address these discrepancies. Another.
Hey, Chris, can I'm going to jump in right there and also add, I think just being able to find that ahead of time was really important for us, because we participate. We do kind of third-party assurance of our environmental performance data each year. And it really stinks to be at the end of your reporting period and have an auditor essentially find that information. So I think finding it up front and being able to disclose that and work with our performance verifiers on the best way to treat that gap was important. And in this case, I think it also delayed our lead project, right, Chris?
Right. Yeah, that's correct. That's an excellent point. So yeah, I definitely recommend, you know, really analyzing and tracking these discrepancies as soon as possible. Yeah, it did delay, in fact, both our LEED and Energy Star process. And because we could not recover that data, you know, like Energy Star, they wouldn't allow estimates. So it's definitely something that you want to track right away, you know, not only to get your data accurate, but also so that you're eligible for a lot of these green building certifications. So I think that's an excellent point that you brought up, Becca.
Sorry, Chris, I know I interrupted you. You were about to, I think, share another example, but I just wanted to make sure we hit that.
Yeah, that's a definitely good point. I mean, yeah, another example that I was going to mention was it had to do with the water. So kind of the same criteria, you know, analyzing the water usage for one of our retail properties, we noticed that there was also a huge spike in the water usage from one month to the other. So with that, we were able to contact the property team and also found out that the reason behind that was a water leak. And once they identified that, they were able to look into the property and fix it. So, you know, analyzing data is not only important in terms of correcting your data in terms of, you know, complying with things like your local benchmarking laws or green building certifications, but also to see where certain areas you can improve on in your building systems.
And out of curiosity, Chris, were you able to draw any conclusions around the cost savings or anything financially related to these problems that you were able to solve with the data? Like, could you say, this company saved X amount of dollars by fixing this water leak through your data analysis versus, you know, waiting until someone stumbled upon it?
Yeah, definitely. I think for these two specific examples, we didn't do that, but definitely if you're tracking your monthly costs in your data collection process, then that's something that you can easily pull from either, you know, like a third-party vendor like Measurabl or other reporting platforms, but you can also track that information in Energy Star as well. So yeah, if you are tracking your cost data, it's definitely something that you could pull up easily. So yeah, that is something we've looked at on a portfolio level, but yeah, I think for these two specific properties, we didn't look into, you know, specifically.
Yeah, right. Well, always when like if there's a huge data quality error of like more usage, it's always good to go look into it. I was talking to a customer yesterday. They just started tracking their utility usage. They had just bought the property from another owner. And the owner was a large institutional owner, so they thought, okay, you know, they would have all the utility data set up correctly. Well, when they started automating it, they realized they were just paying a crazy amount for their energy bill in relation to the size of their building. And when they drilled into it a little deeper, the meter of the next door restaurant in the building that they didn't own and wasn't their tenant, they had been paying that energy bill comparative to like it was a smaller grocery store. And so for a few months they had paid the bill, and I think it got up to like $100,000 that they had already paid that wasn't their tenant, their building. And so catching that early on, I guess was good for them. They realized that the prior owner had been paying that other building's energy bill the entire time of ownership. So having tools to allow you to automate or collect the data in some form or fashion, and then using these tools to analyze it. And if the tools alert you early enough, like Becca said, it's going to not only help in assurance, but also might save your company a substantial amount of money.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's a crazy example. I don't know if I've heard of, you know, that big of a mistake on a utility bill before. And out of curiosity, Becca, have you seen anything like this through your work at Jamestown?
I mean, we haven't had anything that extreme. I mean, we've definitely been able to kind of isolate a few water leaks in particular. You know, fountains seem to always be the culprit. But no, as far as I know, that we aren't paying any energy bills that we're not meaning to pay. But I will say, just kind of asking the detailed questions, particularly in a lot of our buildings that are historic adaptive reuse. A lot of our assets aren't, kind of standard office buildings. And so we have definitely had some complicated metering scenarios where we've had to kind of go in and, do some, kind of advanced analysis to figure out where our water is going in certain buildings. But no, I don't think we found anything like that. One point that I did want to make, though, is, specifically in regards to analyzing the data, one thing that I didn't totally understand when I first started this job is the data that you need for sustainability reporting, whole building data, isn't necessarily the best information to use when you're talking internally about creating value or decreasing your operating expenses. And what I mean by that is, depending on your lease type and the type of how your building is set up, the landlord paid utility bills might not represent your whole building energy or water consumption. And so I think it's just important when you're analyzing the data to think about what that means. So for example, I might have whole building data with financial information in Energy Star and Measurabl. But when I'm talking about those savings, or any savings related to that building, it would be whole building savings. I don't get too bogged down in the split incentive just because, I think that savings are great, whether it's for the tenant or us as a landlord. But at the end of the day, I think it's just important to understand who's realizing any of those savings. One of the things that we've done recently in an effort to kind of close that gap between the information that we're reporting on and the information that we need to talk about the value to Jamestown as a landlord is we've automated our landlord paid utility bills into a platform that's really meant for utility bill analysis. The idea is that will then populate Energy Star and then populate Measurabl. So we're still kind of using that central data source and only kind of inputting the data once. But I would just recommend that everybody kind of think about what they're looking at and where the financial impact of that is.
Right, and that's an excellent point to make. Even though we, as we talked about earlier, are trying to get all of this data together, it's really important to think about what data you actually need to drive, these different activities and these different value creation initiatives that each organization is running. And I'm again going to use that as a segue to the step 3, which is implementing those changes through the data. Chris, we talked about identifying those problem areas before with the data, but how do you use the same data or maybe even different data to identify opportunities of improvement?
Yeah, so I think Becca sort of touched on that just now in the previous slide, but yeah, I think generally what we focus on when we're managing our properties is to track both common area usage and tenant area usage. In general, in my opinion, I think it really depends on how granular your data is. The more granular, the better. So if you're able to track what your energy consumption is for your common area and your tenant, then you can really drill down and see, where you should be focusing your efforts on. There's also additional things that you can analyze as well. For example, maybe if you have separate parking lot lights or if you have water irrigation, those things you can also separate as well. And once you're able to track that data, then you're able to, really drill in and see where your big energy users are. So yeah, I think that's really my advice. If you want to really implement these data-driven changes, you definitely want to try to get very granular data. So, and it's helped us as well because a lot of our properties are huge properties with a lot of common area spaces, but a lot of tenants who use a lot of energy. So it's helped us really track where our big energy users are.
Can you give us an example of one of these opportunities that you've identified?
Yeah, sure. So I think one example is we had a big sort of retail property located in New York. It was over 1 million square feet. So how we were getting the data was through Con Edison, which is basically New York's utility provider, and they offer whole building data. But like Becca was saying earlier, basically the information that they were giving us was just, seeing month over month how much that whole basically campus, how much your energy consumption was each month, but it wasn't really helping us in terms of seeing where we should be focusing our energy efficiency efforts. So what we did was we kind of, we did have access to the landlord paid bills. So once we were able to track that, we used some methodology to separate out the energy usage. And we were able to see, how much energy is used by the common area and how much energy is used by the tenants. And with that, we were able to drill in and see, what we should be focusing on. So I think that's one example that we can, or that I can think of.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. Becca, what have you seen as the biggest opportunities through these data-driven changes?
For us, a lot of time it's operational stuff. So, one of the things that we've looked at through the interval data programs is like optimal startup, and been able to maybe find some instances where a setting in the automation system got changed to accommodate a special circumstance like a holiday or an event, and might not have gotten reset. I mean, that's kind of your classic example from one of these programs. I think that's probably the biggest opportunity that we found.
That's a great response, Becca. Chris, I had a follow-up on your point, and I remember working on this data capture for that big building in New York. So when you get the data from Con Edison at the whole building level, and then you use a certain methodology to separate it down as common and tenant. And I guess the question I'm looking at is like, now when we have common and tenant, what are strategies you guys do? Are you guys more looking at reducing energy on the tenant side or the common area side?
Yeah, I think, that's a really good point that you brought up. It really depends, I think. Of course, I think it's easiest to focus on the energy usage on a common area side because, the landlord is paying the bills, and then they're more, they have operational control over those areas. So I think that's the easiest to tackle. But I also think that, the landlord is more cognizant of their energy usage, whereas, a lot of the tenant spaces, they're in charge of their own equipment and they pay their own bills. And oftentimes, from my experience, I've noticed that, for example, if they have very inefficient fluorescent lights in their spaces, as long as it's working, the workers are happy, they wouldn't really touch it. So I think the biggest opportunities is actually in the tenant spaces because of that fact. The only thing is it's really challenging because they take care of their own bills, and kind of suggesting these energy efficiency opportunities to them can be challenging, especially for that reason.
Great points. How often does a tenant say yes when you go to them with energy efficiency solutions?
I don't mind taking this one, Chris.
Yeah, Becca, that might be a good one for you.
I mean, not to just give a general answer, but it really depends on the tenant. I mean, I think in some instances, we've been able to have a lighting vendor go in and do a whole building assessment that includes the tenant spaces. And we've been able just to split that cost and, then charge the tenant for the cost of improving their space if the lease allows. We've had other instances where the tenants did it themselves. Some of our leases have a maximum lighting power density that's specified. So when the tenant is building out their space, they are keeping that under a certain threshold. And then in other instances, we might do the upgrade ourselves as part of the landlord work when we're turning over a tenant space to prepare it for a new tenant coming in. So it really depends, but I think we haven't talked a ton about green leases on this webinar. Green leases are definitely a tool that is helpful to have in your toolbox, whether it's to actually get the data, whether it's related to provisions that say that the tenant must provide, utility data to the landlord, to help with whole building benchmarking, or if it's language related to the ability to pass through the cost of a capital project that saves energy. You know, it might not work for every instance, and you might be able to get a project implemented and share the cost even without having that green lease language in place. But it's definitely a helpful tool to have.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I definitely agree with Becca, the importance of green leases and really, you know, adjusting the lease so that, more importantly, in terms of data, that they're able to disclose that data. Because oftentimes we found that for reporting purposes, maybe we are tracking everything, all the energy usage in a building, but maybe they have that one retail tenant that's paying their own bills that's not willing to give up their data. You know, that has been a barrier in terms of getting, you know, basically partial energy data to whole building data. And sometimes if they have these local ordinances, that could be the reason what's, you know, keeping you from complying from that local ordinance. So it's definitely very important to write that into the lease. And it's something that we're starting to do from now on in order to get that data. So excellent point.
Yeah, I love that you both brought up the green leases. I'm always curious, sitting inside of these commercial real estate companies, how do you guys navigate within to promote green leases being brought into your guys' new leases? Or like, can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think it was 2014 when we, you know, really kind of seriously modified all of our existing template leases. You know, really, it was the Green Lease Leaders program that provided us kind of a roadmap and some opportunity for recognition. And it just so happened that we had executed a few green leases ourselves, really for the goal of achieving LEED certification, and we needed to be able to make assumptions for our energy model to do so. So we used green leases as a tool to ensure that a building under development was going to reach its energy goals. And then we also had a few examples of green leases that we had inherited from other owners. So we kind of did an internal assessment, found some of those clauses internally, and basically came up with a short list of language that we wanted incorporated into all of our lease templates. For us, we have template agreements, but leasing is handled regionally. So we were able to distribute those to the regional teams and outside counsel who was handling that. And we've seen a lot of success from it. You know, I think it's a good way. It's not the only way that sustainability should be discussed when you're starting a relationship with a new tenant. But I do think it's helpful to have the language in there, and it's certainly given us a little more flexibility and just a little more kind of assurance that that we'll have the tenants kind of on board for some of our sustainability efforts, whether it's a LEED certification or something that's just more reporting based. You know, investors, other stakeholders, they expect owners to have this information. And so, you know, I think the lease language is, like I said, just a helpful tool to have. We have had a few questions from certain tenants, nothing major, and to my knowledge, we haven't had any tenant strike any of the green lease language. Now that it's established, though, we really don't make a huge deal about it. You know, I think it just depends on your culture and your perspective and how you want to address it. It's something that we definitely want our managers and our asset managers and property managers and brokers to be familiar with. But, you know, I don't think it's something that needs necessarily a big disclaimer because it's just part of the way that we do business at this point.
Got it. And that's an excellent example. I mean, from, you know, an outside perspective, at least, it's interesting to me that Jamestown has essentially, from what it sounds like, built-in green leases to the majority, if not all, of the new leases that you're signing. Can you speak more to the adoption of this process into what has become the norm? Like, was there any pushback? Did you have any challenges that you had to overcome when doing this, or were people fairly on board with getting green leases into Jamestown structure?
Yeah, I mean, we're a relatively small company, so I think that, you know, if you were kind of a larger multinational company with thousands of employees across the globe, I'm sure it would be a little more complicated. We just worked with our in-house legal team and, you know, first kind of showed them the external resources and some of the research that was done by, you know, IMT and the Greenleaf Library and others. And then we kind of put together we worked with them to kind of put together a concise set of recommendations for our own portfolio. And then we just sent it out. So, you know, I think we had the buy-in from the folks that were, you know, really kind of going to be the boots on the ground, making sure that that language was in there and, you know, they felt comfortable with it. And so we just, we moved forward.
Got it. And I'm curious, Chris or Mel, I'm not sure which one of you would have seen this more often, but what has been the industry adoption as a whole in terms of green leases? Have people on the market been buying into green leases, or is Jamestown one of the leaders in this new way of engaging tenants on sustainability?
In my humble opinion, Jamestown is one of the leaders that has brought it throughout their organization and really implemented it as best practice. Chris, I would love to hear your thoughts on maybe perhaps your other customers you work with.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think Jamestown is definitely one of the leaders, and it is something that we've been recommending to our other clients, and it's something that they're starting to write into their leases and adopt. But yeah, I think Jamestown is definitely one of the first to do that. So yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think one trend that I'm certainly seeing, and, you know, it just depends on your organization, but, you know, net zero leasing is something that I know certain institutions are considering, so leasing to help achieve net zero energy goals. You know, I think that's a really kind of unique instance that we haven't dealt with, but it's, you know, I think when you have a tenant and a landlord that have, you know, really strong goals and aligned values, and that's what I think is really interesting. You know, the other kind of question that I've been asked is, you know, how leases can also support health and well-being or resilience and some of these other topics that are coming up in the you know, real estate sustainability space. So, you know, I think it's definitely a moving target.
That's really interesting to me, Becca. I haven't heard a whole lot about net zero leasing. Can you speak more to any experience that you've had, either through your work at Jamestown or maybe some of your peers have been working towards getting net zero leasing into the written contracts that you have with tenants?
Yeah, I think Rocky Mountain Institute is probably the best organization, and Mel, I'm not sure if you're aware of any others. I think they've got some case studies and some white papers out there. It's not something that I have a lot of experience in. It's just something that I'm, you know, generally familiar with, and so I'm going to defer to the experts on that one. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it's from the cases that I'm thinking of, it's, you know, relatively smaller, newer development projects where, you know, a developer or an owner, you know, from the outset has these goals, and really kind of forms a partnership with the tenant that shares those goals and values and wants to put language in place to achieve, you know, net zero energy.
Got it. And thank you for sharing that. As an industry as a whole, what would you expect we need to achieve in order to have green leasing and, as a next step, net zero leasing be a part of our normal process as a real estate industry? Where do you guys see this going?
I mean, I could chime in real quick. What I hear is the more we can automate and streamline processes. So in Becca's case, she's mentioned how they've integrated this in just their standard business process, so it's simple and integrated. So giving the industry leaders or commercial real estate organizations these tools to streamline green leases or net zero buildings. How can a building achieve being net zero? That is like the new hot topic. It'll make it easier to get implemented when there's a lot of manual work around it. I think that's what takes when things take longer to get done. So that's my 2 cents.
Chris, Becca, anything to add?
No, yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. I think, a lot of the times when, I think it's really just educating a lot of the tenants also, kind of explaining the benefits, why they're doing this, why they're trying to go towards net zero. And also, yeah, I agree, the more centralized, streamlined the process, the less work for them, and then they'll be able to buy into it more. So yeah, definitely agree with that.
Yeah, Mel, I'm glad that you mentioned some of the logistical, considerations. For example, if we buy a building and there's not even, tenant level submetering installed, there are some kind of cost implications and some challenges to that kind of full transparency in terms of, how much are the tenants consuming, or how is an individual tenant performing. I think the other thing is just being transparent about cost and being realistic about what values your tenants have. For example, we do a very kind of a common but pretty robust tenant assessment each year, a tenant feedback process partnered with the Kingsley survey, or the Kingsley Index. And so that's really helpful. Those sustainability questions are good just to get feedback from the tenants on, why they're interested in sustainability, what they, what else they're interested in that we might not be doing currently. And so I think just kind of getting that feedback and being transparent about any implications or any shared cost is important, and just keeps that relationship honest.
Thank you for that. So last but definitely not least would be step 4 in this outline of how to advance sustainability initiatives at your organization. We've touched on this in some ways already, but step 4 we're calling tracking your progress and better understanding your ROI. So with that, Becca, I'd love to hear your short review on what processes you've implemented to track the progress of your sustainability initiatives over the years that you've been at Jamestown.
Yeah, I'm happy to. One of the things that we did early on was we set performance targets. This is really common in real estate and other industries as well. So back in, I guess, 2012, we set 2020 performance targets. And then as the years went on, we realized that our base year data wasn't as clean as we wanted it. And we realized that 8 years isn't the best time frame to track sustainability goals. So we decided to reset our goals to be on a 10-year time period. And we decided to use 2014 as our baseline year. I started at the company at the end of 2012. And so, it just, I think, speaks to the fact that it really can be a process to get all of your data cleaned up and get that information flowing. So 2014 we felt was the first year that we had really clean data. So we now have 2024 performance targets. And so that's been helpful just to kind of track our progress over time towards those goals. We also look at year over year, like for like performance. So what is the performance of buildings owned in both years of a 2-year period? And we track our projects in Measurabl. So, I think, project tracking is great. It's nice to be able to associate performance improvement with a specific initiative. And also it's nice to have some real kind of performance validation rather than just an estimate based on the proposal that you have from your vendor. What I think is interesting is, like, are you using this information to justify a project, or are you using this information to, like, brag and put together a nice case study after the project is done? And I think you can use the data for both, but I think just kind of being realistic about what you have, how you can use it, and how that ties into your overall goals is important.
Definitely, and that makes a lot of sense. I think that speaks to the earlier point that we made about, what are you actually using this data for, and that will help determine, 1, the data that you collect, and then 2, how you actually can make sure it's doing what you need it to do. Chris, I'm curious, in your role, what have you seen for best practices on tracking progress of each of your projects over time?
Yeah, so I think that, as Becca mentioned, I think, using a tool like Measurabl or maybe Energy Star, I think that's the best way that I've been kind of tracking how energy has been improving. Especially with Energy Star, you're able to kind of track, how your Energy Star score is changing. And, for example, if you know that the property implemented some energy efficient project for a certain month, you can actually in Energy Star or Measurabl look at those months and see how much impact that particular project has had. So I've usually been doing that, especially when I've been doing things like energy audits, where we're able to recommend some energy saving measures. And if they do implement it, it's something that I do take note of so that when I look at the data, I can see how much they actually saved and how much, both cost and energy usage. So I think that's one tool that I've been using to effectively track progress.
What sorts of projects have you seen the biggest changes on? I know it might vary building on building, but where have you seen the most improvements made?
Yeah, I think where I've seen the most improvements made, if you're speaking specifically to an energy efficient project, I think it comes in terms of upgrading their lights. Not only because it's one of, it's a low hanging fruit item. And by that, I mean basically a recommendation that has basically, zero to low cost. So, things like adjusting maybe your set points or your lighting schedules, things like that. But also lights, generally, if you look into your utility provider, they typically have very good rebates that go towards lighting projects, upgrading your fluorescents or metal halides to LEDs and, showing good payback. I can remember one particular property. It was an office property where when we went on site to look at their lighting systems, they had basically just fluorescent lights, both in their interior and also in their parking lot, their open parking lot as well. So what they were able to do was take advantage of a very good rebate program for lights through your utility provider. And with that, they were able to significantly cut down their initial first cost so that they had a really good payback and ROI on that project. So I think just with all the projects that I've been working on, the fact that generally lights have very good rebates and they're a low-hanging fruit item, I've seen the biggest change on that. And when looking into a data management platform, I've been able to track when they implemented that project, and I was able to see pretty good savings from it as well. So I would say that's one of the biggest changes that I've seen in terms of projects that's made an impact.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. Mel, I'm going to take this out of the building level a little and speak more at the portfolio level. What best practices have you seen for tracking progress over time across a number of buildings as opposed to just one?
Yeah, good question. And Becca probably has a lot to add specifically for Jamestown. But, as we know in commercial real estate, sustainability, all the front movers are reporting to GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. They're looking at your like-for-like changes and scoring you on that. So, your score is going to change. It's going to be better if you're having those like-for-like decreases or absolute decreases, and it all goes down. Like, how does that even happen? It goes down to what Chris is saying. You have to implement projects at the site level for reductions to take place and then to roll up to the portfolio. And how is that scored currently? A lot of people are using GRESB as that standard. But Becca, I would love your 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and I totally agree. I like to kind of take in I like to collect the information once, whether it's project information, performance data, and kind of use it for a variety of reporting purposes. So, for example, a project, like Mel said, has the benefit of actually helping to earn GRESB points based on your kind of portfolio coverage of different efficiency projects. And then obviously it has the benefit of hopefully moving the needle and impacting your performance. Other kind of things that I like to do when I have a successful project is talk about it in our annual report. And also, when it makes sense, make it the highlight of a case study. And so I think you can get a lot of kind of mileage out of a project, but ultimately our goal is to create value, to increase our NOI, save money for us and our tenants. And certainly GRES helps kind of tell that story to our investors in a quantitative way.
Becca, I'm curious, with a successful project, maybe you have a specific example in mind, but with a successful project, how have you scaled that across your portfolio from maybe one building or a handful of buildings all the way through, you know, all of the sites that you're operating?
Yeah. You know, I think the holy grail for any vendor, whether it's a lighting vendor or some type of automation partner, the holy grail for them is always, you know, let's get a crack at your whole portfolio. And, you know, usually when I get emails from them, they've already put together a list of all the buildings that we own. You know, they've kind of got their blue sky ideas about what we could do. You know, I found that the reality for our portfolio, and we're, you know, we're in the kind of less than 50 buildings range. You know, for us, I found that kind of property by property approach has worked a lot better. You know, we're a diversified portfolio in terms of our use types and our geography and just kind of the scale of our different buildings. And so, you know, excuse me, I think that that kind of desktop analysis is only so useful. I mean, I think what we've done and where I've seen success is kind of doing a lot of the back end work to evaluate certain opportunities at a very high level. For example, I know the buildings that I have that could be a good fit for solar. I know the ones that could be a good fit for battery storage. You know, I've been working with Verdani's help to try and get a good gauge of, you know, where we might have some low-hanging fruit related to lighting upgrades. And, you know, I'll kind of look at our capital budgets and find out where we might be replacing some more major equipment. But at least for me, you know, I haven't found that like comprehensive, you know, let's change out all of our lighting all at the same time, you know, approach has worked. But again, my success in doing it on a more case-by-case basis might be a function of my portfolio size. I know that other peers have had success approaching it on a portfolio basis. And there's a lot of campaigns I think that can also help. You know, for example, we participate in the Smart Energy Analytics campaign as part of the Department of Energy's programs. I know that there's some lighting campaigns that might be kind of a great kind of roadmap or provide some momentum for other owners. I think it's just figuring out what works for you and your asset type and your company culture.
Got it. And building on that point, what are your tips for managing a sustainability program on maybe limited resources or a tighter budget? What have you done to make sure that you found success there?
I think the biggest thing is just, you know, knowing from in terms of your strategic planning, knowing from the beginning what information you need and try to maximize the amount of value that you can get out of that information. You know, I say that when it comes to collecting information, not just from property managers, but pretty much from anyone, it's like the less you ask for, the more you get. You know, I'd rather spend less time doing data collection and more time having kind of one-on-one conversations. So, you know, we've really kind of streamlined the communications that we send, because it's a lot of information. There's a lot of detail. And I totally can see how an end user and a recipient of some of my email requests might get bogged down. So I think keeping it as simple as possible is important. But then also, you know, following up and kind of having that personal touch. You know, typically I try to get to each of my properties once a year so that I know my managers, we have a relationship. But at the very least, you know, jumping on a phone call, you know, after I send that super dense informational email and kind of offering to walk them through it. Again, you know, that structure might look a little different if I had, you know, 10,000 buildings. But, you know, I think personalizing it helps. And, you know, ultimately what I want is, you know, if a manager or anyone has a question, I want them to pick up the phone and call me or call Chris. And so I think that's really helped, you know, motivate them to do that.
Got it. And Chris, what about from your end? Have you establish any best practices around operating a sustainability program on a tight budget?
I mean, I can probably speak to the data side. I haven't been too involved in terms of budgeting, but yeah, I think, in terms of tracking, what are good opportunities for energy efficient measures, I think the biggest thing you really need is just measuring your data. And so I think just really having a centralized process in collecting your data and tracking that on Energy Star is a good start, at least if you're operating on a tight budget.
And, one other thing that I just thought about from like a program management perspective. So I work with Verdani on all of the Jamestown owned properties. And what that's really helped me do is have some consistency. So, a lot of times if you're working with different vendors across the country, it's easy for it to get a little siloed. So for example, if you've got a different vendor helping you with your Energy Star stuff regionally, but then you all of a sudden have to turn around and do a, company-wide sustainability report and crunch your, portfolio-wide performance indicators. You don't really have any eyes on the kind of whole portfolio. It might not always have to be a consulting partner as well, though. So, for example, having all your buildings in the Measurabl platform and having the benefit of those insights can be helpful. Another thing that we do is we participate in the Better Buildings Challenge as a Better Buildings partner. And, we get a report from them each spring, which is, again, just kind of another set of eyes on our information. And so I think, kind of just being strategic about how you resource that can really just make you feel like it doesn't all kind of rest on your shoulders.
Got it, and thank you for sharing that. That's an excellent way for us to end this webinar as we're at the top of the hour. So thank you again to the attendees. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today. So with that, thank you again, everyone, and I hope you have a wonderful day.